Thanks for joining us today and making your way through the snow. I promise today will not be the day that Pastor Corey decides to preach for 2 hours so that we can all make sure we make it home. But we're grateful that you chose to be here. And if you're joining us online at home, you get a new camera angle. So Patrick and Matt did some work. So if you ever watch from home now I know you can make it to church, so don't make this an excuse, okay, that you get to watch from home. But now it looks better. Like, it looks like I'm probably taller a little bit, which is good. And like, make sure it's online with me, all that kind of stuff. So that's great. So thanks, guys, for doing that work. We started this conversation last week. It's called Forgiveness 101. And we've started to dive into what does it actually mean to forgive the way that Scripture teaches us to forgive. And we actually got some good feedback from that, and just people saying, hey, this is a good thing to talk about. And we actually had I got an email actually about somebody saying, I've never heard somebody preach on forgiveness before. And so that's interesting. I don't know. I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, I don't know if that's true for Jesse. I'm still getting a little bit, especially when I look that way. I don't know if I can think back and go, hey, this is something that I've thought about or been preached to, but it's not something that comes up a ton. We might cover it in passing, and we talk about forgiveness as far as how we build a relationship with Jesus and that kind of thing. But what does that actually mean? And so being able to really look into this and dive in and say, what does forgiveness truly mean as we look at it from Scripture, and how do we apply this? And I started it this way last week, that our understanding of forgiveness is broken. I think this is a problem in churches, but I think it's also a problem in culture, that we don't actually understand what true forgiveness actually is. And if we sat down and just kind of had a conversation, and we sat in maybe a small group setting and said, what would be our definition of forgiveness? I think we could come up with something that would be effective. I think we could come up with something that most of us would even agree that it should include certain things and look a certain way. But I think, honestly, if we did that together, if we don't really understand what Scripture says, we would actually come up with something that may be a little bit different than what Scripture actually teaches. And so the goal of this is to say, how do we do this the right way, and what does this look like? And I ask this question: how do you decide whether to forgive someone or not? And I hope that as we walk through the next few weeks of this conversation, that we actually look at that question and say, that's the wrong question. Whether we decide to forgive someone or not is not actually the question. It's how do we do that, and what does that actually look like when we do it effectively? And so that's what we're diving into. That's what we're having the conversation about. And we're going to do that a little bit more today. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 37. So if you want to jump in with us, you can do that in your Bible, if you have a physical Bible, or if you want to scan the QR code that's on the screen or on the bottom of your Next Steps card. That'll take you to the follow along. We're not going to, by the way, if you're sitting at home and doing that, you can do that live as well. We're not going to bounce around too much today, but we will move around a little bit. So if you want to follow along with us there, you're welcome to do that. So in Genesis 37, we're going to start in verse 2. This is what it says in verse 2. It says, "This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing." Now, let's just pause there for a second, right? If you had siblings growing up, you know what this is like, right? Especially if you were the younger one. You would watch what the older one or the older ones were doing, and then what did you do? You reported to the older ones. Parents, we know this too. We will go to the younger one to figure out what the older one did, right? Because they watch and they figure out. So even thousands of years ago, we get set up in this conversation where these siblings are having to work and be around each other, and Joseph is the one who's watching what's going on, and he's the, what do we call that person? The tattletale that goes back to mom and dad and says, hey, this is what's going on. I need you to know about this. So this is not something new. If you experienced this as a kid, this was happening thousands of years ago as well. So going on in verses 3 to 4, it says, "Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him." So we actually learned that this problem is not just within the siblings, right? This is actually a problem that's kind of going top down. This is one of those things, if you're a parent and you ever go somewhere and you leave your kids at home, you can't bring back a gift for one kid, right? You have to bring them for all of however many children you have. You can't just bring one unless it's their birthday or something like that, right? You've got to make sure, and if you experience that as a kid, mom and dad had to bring something for everybody, right? Well, Jacob decides he's going to bring something for Joseph, and the brothers actually know that he likes Joseph better than them. And this is a joke that can be in your family. Like maybe you joke about who's mom and dad's favorite or who's grandma's favorite. This was actually the case for them. And so this creates a very difficult dynamic in their home. And it says this, right, that they wouldn't even say a kind word to him. Their response and their reaction to Joseph was to completely dismiss him. They didn't want to talk to him. They didn't want to have a conversation. They didn't want to know about him. They just kept to their own selves, and they would never go near him. So then going on in verses 5 to 7, it says this: one night, Joseph had a dream. And when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed before mine. Now, if you're reading that, you should be like, Joseph, shut up, right? Just stop talking. You know your brothers don't like you. You know this isn't going to go well, and it's one of those things like if you grow like you know you can get under somebody's skin. I don't know if Joseph enjoyed it or not, if he was like kind of clueless or like whatever. But you just read this and you're like, just stop, right? You're making it worse. So how did the brothers actually respond? Verse 8 says his brothers responded, "So you think you will be our king, do you? You actually think you will reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. So we get this, right? Like this is a very, very difficult family situation. And maybe you've felt some of this kind of thing in your family before where it's just difficult between siblings or family members or whatever, and you kind of feel that drama. And this is way, way worse than a lot of situations, right? Dad is showing favoritism, siblings don't like each other, don't even want to talk to each other. It's just a bad situation all around. And we can learn and kind of see from the text like what the heart of the brothers were like. That they just could not stand Joseph and wanted nothing to do with him. And the idea of building that relationship and kind of reconciling to one another and restoring that was nowhere even close to on their radar. And I think we learn about Joseph's brothers that Joseph's brothers operated from a place of unforgiveness. Now, some of you might go, unforgiveness isn't a word. Google told me it is. So you can take that up with Google. So we're going to use it a few times if that bugs you. But Joseph's brothers operated from a place of unforgiveness. They wanted nothing to do with restoring that relationship. They were kind of just hoping that Joseph would go away. And the reason that this is the way that it is because the ancient world actually didn't have a great framework for forgiveness. If we were to fast forward, like to when Jesus shows up and he explains what forgiveness is, we kind of looked at that last week. That was a new concept for most people in the ancient world. They did not understand what forgiveness was, and that's because they built this culture, and it was identified, or people would look at it as a shame and honor culture. We've moved away from that, but we've actually kind of started to move back towards that a little bit. And a shame and honor culture was any time that you could leverage you being good or you not doing something wrong up and kind of like level yourself up and push somebody else down, that's what you did. And so the goal was to create as much separation between you being good and someone else being bad, or the people that are bad just keep shoving them down and getting rid of them and working them down. This was the concept. So when Joseph's brothers are kind of going through this, they're realizing or thinking, Joseph is wrong, he's not good, he says these bad things, he treats us poorly, whatever it is. And they would continue to try and create this chasm between them and Joseph. We do this sometimes as well. It's called cancel culture. So anytime somebody does something that's wrong and we want to tear them down or make it look worse, right? Some people will say, okay, well now we didn't do that, so clearly we're better than them. And we create this chasm between us as far as good and bad, and we continue to work that to make it as far a gap as possible. And this is the framework. This is the way it worked in the ancient world. If anybody had the opportunity to get a one-up on you, they would. And they would continue to do that. And it would be so much so that if anyone actually offered what true forgiveness was, it would be seen as weak. And the reason it would be seen as weak is because if somebody didn't leverage your wrongdoing against you, then they weren't taking advantage of the opportunity. If they didn't look at their wrongdoers and say, I'm going to make sure that what you did is clearly identified and you get pushed down and I get leveled up because of it, then they were seen as weak. Because they didn't take advantage of the opportunity they had to hold it against somebody. We can do this too. There are times we don't want to forgive, and we don't want people to be able to get away with what they did. We want them to feel what it's like to have the repercussions of that. And there are consequences for actions. But we think about it differently, and we don't want to create that chasm, and we don't want to be able to kind of push people down while we level each other up, and we don't want to be able to see that as weak. We'll come back to that conversation in a little bit. But this is what happens later in the story for Joseph. So we're still in chapter 37, going to verses 18 to 20. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him from a distance. Just to give you the kind of in-between, because we're jumping down a little bit. Joseph was going to find his brothers, couldn't find them for a while, so he follows them around and kind of figures it out. So then he gets on their trail. They see him coming. It says, as he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. By the way, he had another dream that was like the first dream, and he told them about it again. So that's why they keep calling him dreamer. He kind of kept rubbing it in. So verses 23 to 25. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and threw him into a cistern. Now the cistern was empty, and there was no water in it. Then just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming towards them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Going on verses 26 to 27, Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. So they get the opportunity, right, to get rid of him. And they decide, okay, they won't kill him, right? Judah steps in, kind of helps him out there. But they end up selling him. They end up selling him for like $20. They're just like, let's just get rid of him and throw him away and never have to deal with him again. Now, it's interesting that when we get to this part of the story, you kind of feel a little bit of conflict there. Like certain brothers are like, let's kill him and get rid of him. Certain brothers are like, well, let's pump the brakes on that like for a second, right? There's a little bit of friction in how we want to do this. How is this actually going to play out, and what's this going to look like? And I think that this is true, that unchecked unforgiveness will lead to regretful actions. We may not think this is true whenever we harbor unforgiveness towards somebody. But my guess is somewhere along the way, if we hold on to it long enough, we might say or do something we didn't mean to say or do. We might respond to a situation in a way that we shouldn't have, like whether it's lashing out or it's showing anger or something like that in a way that we shouldn't have. It might be having a conversation, like we're having that unforgiveness held against somebody, and we go to somebody else and have a conversation and gossip in a way that we shouldn't have, and maybe that conversation shouldn't have happened. We will do things out of this place of unforgiveness that are regretful. And I think we see that when this part of the story comes, that some people, they were like, let's get rid of him. And some brothers are like, wait, we've held on to this contempt and this unforgiveness too long, and now we're at a point where we're going to do something that's not okay. And in that sense, I think that there can be types of unforgiveness. I think there can be types of false forgiveness. And kind of thinking this through, there's two examples I want to walk through as we ponder and kind of think about, are we harboring this idea of unforgiveness against other people? There's two types of false forgiveness I want to talk about. Number one is this. Excused, we will excuse something but not forgive it. This is what would happen in the ancient world. So with their understanding of forgiveness, what they would do was they would just kind of go, oh, that's okay, you did this thing against me, I'm just going to be fine with it, and I'll just make sure that you get known as someone who messes up and makes mistakes and does wrong things, but I wasn't that, so I'm just going to keep moving on with my life. And we kind of just like excuse it, but we don't forgive it. This is very easy to do in our culture as well. You might get to a point where you're like, I just don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to do this. I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to have the tough conversation. I'm just going to let it go. And we kind of just go, I'm not going to worry about it. Okay, it's fine, no problem. But really, when we say that, if we tell somebody that maybe is apologizing to us or did something wrong, and we just say, oh, yeah, that's fine, don't worry about it, but we really don't actually let it go. we still kind of feel like it's a problem. And I'm not talking about like processing and getting to a place of forgiveness. I just mean we're holding on to it, and it changes our view of that person completely. And it influences how we understand our relationship with that person, and it never changes. So we can excuse something, but not forgive it. The second type of false forgiveness is this, that something could be repaid, but not forgiven. That we would cause somebody to have to give us something, to have to pay something towards us, whether it's apologizing or it's paying us back or it's whatever. Like we'll put that standard in there. Let me put it in a different term, okay? Some of us have mortgages. Some of us probably still have school loans. Some of us have both, like me, right? We just have these things are just around, right? And if somebody comes to you and says, hey, we're going to forgive your student loans, like Sally Mae or Jimmy Sue or whoever has my loans, right? They come to me and they say, hey, this is who's going to forgive. We're going to forgive your loans. I'd say, great. And they go, but you still have to pay half of it. Well, that's great. Like, that's cool and all, but that's not forgiving it, right? If your mortgage company came to you and said, we're going to forgive your mortgage, you say, great, but they say you still have to pay 75% of it. You'd say that's good, right? That's a nice discount, but you'd say that's not forgiveness. But here's the thing. When we do this relationally all the time, where we'll say, we forgive you if you will do X, Y, and Z. And we kind of lower the cost maybe. Maybe it's just saying, I'm sorry, or maybe it's just recognizing the pain, or maybe it's just paying back part of it, or it's just replacing the thing that you broke, but it's really not forgiveness. And we understand that when it comes to monetary terms, but we don't understand it when it comes to relationships. Because just making someone pay less of a debt is not actually forgiveness. And that brings a word to our minds, and it's the idea of like fairness, right? But that's not fair. It's not fair that they would get forgiven from that. But forgiveness, and we'll kind of come back to this a little bit, and I talked about it last week, forgiveness is absorbing that debt and saying you don't owe the debt anymore to whoever has wronged you. And here's what happens. Both of these issues, both of these false forgivenesses will lead to bitterness and contempt. Ultimately, what happens is we hold on to this unforgiveness and we refuse to forgive it, and we're the ones who will hold on to that burden. How do I know that? Because we might say to somebody, you might tell someone, right, like, I forgive you, and they will walk away thinking they are completely forgiven. And if we don't forgive them, who's left holding that burden? We are. They don't know. They assumed you forgave them. But we're the ones who still, when we think about that person, we feel that kind of twist of the knife or pit in our stomach or whatever it might be, and it builds up, just like Joseph's brothers. And ultimately what they did was something that they would regret, maybe immediately, maybe some of them not until later. But it leads to this bitterness and contempt that we continue to hold on to if we don't actually forgive them. So let me ask us this question and kind of like bring it back together. Why does forgiveness matter? You ever think about the fact that like forgiveness is something that's important within Christianity, but forgiveness is important for everybody, right? Like we send our kids right now and go to a public school. I hope that the understanding of forgiveness, or at least a kind of thought process about forgiveness, is being taught to our kids at a public school, right? In general, we kind of hope that we would have a conversation with our kids and make sure we understand how to say we're sorry and make sure that we recognize when we hurt someone, and we try and make sure we put that back together, right? That's not just a Christian thing, that's an everybody thing. But why? Why does it matter? Why wouldn't it matter if just somebody, why doesn't shame and honor culture work? Like if someone's going to do something that's wrong, why wouldn't we just tear them apart and level up? If we're not as bad as them, why don't we just continue to go through life? Why is that something that's not good? And a few months ago, we were having a conversation like just before the election on how we handle relationships with people and what that looks like. And we talked about, one of the final weeks, we talked about this idea of contempt. And I used this quote. I have a couple of quotes I just want to use again just to help us understand this. But Arthur Schopenhauer had this to say. He said, contempt is the unsullied conviction of the worthlessness of another. We'll get there sometimes when we're unwilling to forgive somebody. Like they'll kind of just become worthless in our brain because they did something to us, and so we just want to forget about them and move on. This is Joseph's brothers. They were willing to just sell him so they didn't have to deal with him anymore. We will get to the point where we just like, we won't go near them. We won't go to the place where they are, or we will go the opposite direction if we see them because we just want nothing to do with it. And then In one of the books I read, it's called Love Your Enemy, Arthur Brooks was quoting another guy who was his name is Dr. Gottman, and he was a couples therapist. And this is what he had to say. It says, Gottman points out that people in couples who are constantly battling die 20 years earlier on average than those who consistently seek mutual understanding. From his perspective, when he saw couples that were consistently at each other over and over and over, it would literally take years off their life. This is why when we get into these places where either we refuse to forgive somebody, we feel it, or if someone refuses to forgive us, we feel it. And the reason is this. If we go to Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, this is what the author says. What do people really get for all their hard work? I've seen the burden God has placed on us all. Yet God has made everything beautiful in its time. This is the key. He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. So he's planted eternity in everybody's heart. Not just the hearts of those who know God or who follow Jesus, but everybody. That's why all of us feel that pain, whether we're a follower of Jesus or not, when someone won't forgive us or when we refuse to forgive somebody else. And this is why I think that is. I think that we will bear the burden of our unforgiveness because we know the gift forgiveness is to the human soul. We know that that's important. We can feel it. And it's so deeply ingrained in us that when we hold on to that contempt and we refuse to forgive somebody or somebody else, it can make us physically sick. Like when you are stressed, I don't know where you carry your stress, but I bet you it affects you physically. And unforgiveness is, and contempt, our mental conversation, right? It's something we hold on to up here. We refuse to do it. It's a thought process, but it will impact us physically. Let me give you a story that's completely false. I just made this up. I want to be really clear and just kind of help us understand this, all right? So let's say when we were decorating our Christmas tree at our house, right? My guess is like we have certain ornaments that are a little more like sentimental and valuable to us. Like, and you probably have the same thing, right? And where do you put those ornaments on the tree? You put them up higher, away from the pets and away from the children and away from all the stuff so you can see them and they don't get broken and that kind of thing, right? That's kind of how we do it. So what if while we were putting together our tree and decorating our tree, what if Carter, my 4-year-old, grabbed one that was breakable and sentimental and someone had given to me or whatever, and he tried to put it on the tree and he dropped it and he broke it? And some of you would probably feel a little bit of that. Like if you've got ornaments that family members who have passed away gave to you or something like that, like you would feel that for a moment. It would be like, oh no, like I can't just go to Hallmark and buy another one. Like this is a problem that now I don't have this ornament anymore. And if he came to me and he said, Dad, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And I say, yeah, buddy, it's okay, right? That's probably the correct response. But if I told you that story and I said, Carter looked at me and said, Daddy, will you forgive me? I said, nope, Carter, not forgiving you. Because that was important to me and you didn't listen and you broke it. And then the next day he comes back and he says, Daddy, will you forgive me? I said, nope, not forgiving you. And then the next day he comes back, Daddy, will you forgive me for breaking your arm? Nope, not going to do it. You should all be feeling how much of a monster I would be in that situation, right? Let me be very clear. Did not happen. Pastor Corey's not a monster, okay? Made it up completely, right? I made it up, right? Okay. So, but you could feel that. Like, and if I told you that story and I told you for like that I actually did that, you would probably look at me and at least you should, Corey, why are you not, like I get that, like we all understood. There's stuff that could break that would be valuable and we would be sad about and we would want to replace that we can't and all that stuff, right? But to not forgive something like that would be ridiculous and silly and we all would know it as wrong. Why? Because forgiveness is a gift to the human soul. And because when we hold on to, like I said before, we hold on to unforgiveness, and we even allow people to think we've forgiven them, and they go about their day, sometimes we decide we want to hold on to that unforgiveness, and it's just a burden that then we decide to bear. It's not the way Jesus asked us to do it. Let me help you think about it a different way. I was having a conversation one time, and I've had conversations with different people that kind of go this direction sometimes, where they will allow something to continue to happen, and they don't want it to, but they don't want to bring it up, right? So I think I was having a conversation with somebody. I think I was a teenager, and maybe, I forget what it was. Maybe someone would say something to me, or it was a name someone would call me or something like that. And the person looked at me and goes, do you really want them to call you that? And I was like, oh, it's not a big deal. I'm not worried about it. It's not a thing. And they were like, yeah, but don't you wish it was different? And I said, I do wish it was different. I think that's an important question. Don't you wish it was different? Like if there's something in life, we will be okay with stuff and we'll just kind of brush it away and not worry about it because we don't want to deal with it. But we have to ask this question. Don't you wish it was different? And sometimes when we ask that question, we are the ones keeping it from being different. We might say, I wish they would know how much that matters to me. I wish they knew how much that actually did hurt me. I wish they did understand how when they say that or do that, or whatever, it affects me. But when we are unwilling to identify it and talk about it and bring it up and have the conversation and try and restore the relationship instead of just excusing it and having that false forgiveness, we leave it the way it is and it doesn't work out well and we hold on to it. And if there are things that you'd say, don't you wish it was different? And your answer would be yes. We have to have the hard conversation. I think another reason that this is so difficult for us to kind of process and understand is because we desire justice. We want people to have the repercussions for the wrong things they do. And that makes total sense. If someone does something that's worth, like if it's bad enough they should go to prison for it, then that's the consequence. If it's something that, you've got to figure it out and they should be fired from their job or they shouldn't have that oversee that project anymore, or like there's repercussions for the things we do and we desire justice, but the way that we go about that matters. And what that looks like is very, very important. We're not going to read the rest of the story of Joseph. We're going to get back to part of it, but I want to kind of fill in the gaps just in case you've never read it. If you've never read the story of Joseph, just go start in Genesis 37 and read to chapter 50, okay? But here's what happens. Joseph gets sold into slavery. He goes through this winding road. Sometimes things look like they're going to be really good, and then things get bad again. But ultimately what happens is he works his way up to be the second in command in the nation of Egypt. This never should have happened, right? This is kind of crazy that this happened, but God works in his way and gets in there. And Joseph had a dream that there was going to be a famine, and it was going to last for years. So when that happened, he made sure that everybody knew in his area, this famine's going to happen, so we're going to make sure we have enough food. So what happened during that famine then is that people would come to Egypt to get food because Egypt had stored up and been ready for it. Well, guess who comes looking for food? Joseph's brothers. And they end up before Joseph. And Joseph, like any good brother would, messes with them the whole time, right? Because they have no idea what's going on. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. He messes with them a little bit. But ultimately what happens is through tears, he says to them, he tells them who he is. And he gets his relationship with his dad back, and they bring all of their families, his brothers and wives and kids, and everybody comes to Egypt and cares for everybody. But eventually Jacob dies. So that's where we're going to pick up the stories. In Genesis 50, verses 14 to 15, says this. After burying Jacob, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had accompanied him to his father's burial. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show his anger and pay us back for all the wrong we did to him, they said. Verses 16 to 18. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of the God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. When Joseph received this message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. After all these years, here's what happened. Joseph's brothers actually expected a false forgiveness from Joseph. And I think they expected it in both the ways we talked about earlier. Number one, they thought Joseph was just excusing their sin until the dad died. And then he would come back. That debt wasn't forgiven. It was just on hold until dad wasn't in the picture anymore. And then Joseph would take advantage of the debt he had, of the leverage he had over them, and he would take it out on them. And Jacob expected the same thing. That's why he says to the brothers, make sure you tell Joseph that I'm saying that he should forgive you. They expected that debt wasn't actually forgiven, that it was just excused and it would be brought back up later. Also, they thought maybe they could repay it. And they thought maybe he would forgive them if they paid part of that debt. And that's why at the end they come and they throw themselves at him and say, we will be your slaves so that you don't take out your anger, your unforgiveness on us. And so in both ways, they think false forgiveness is coming, and they're even willing to be slaves in order to make sure Joseph doesn't do what he could do to them. But verses 19 and 21 tell us what Joseph did. So it says, "But Joseph replied, 'Don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children.' So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. And what Joseph offered was true forgiveness. He had let go and absorbed the debt that they owed to him from the mistreatment that they gave him earlier in life. It didn't matter that dad wasn't around and his relationship with his dad was good, but not with his brothers. He said, it doesn't matter to me what dad wanted to do. I will forgive you. And he doesn't even say that they have to be his slaves. He just says, everything is well. I've absorbed that debt. I want to go back just briefly to Ecclesiastes, the Ecclesiastes verses in 9 through 11. This is what it says, right? He said, right in the middle, we'll just pick it up in the middle. It says, he has planted eternity in the human heart, but even so, and this is the important part, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. Isn't that what Joseph just said? He said, you didn't see what was going on for what it was. Joseph's brothers thought they were doing wrong to Joseph. Ultimately, he says God was in control of all of that, and he did the work to make it something that would be a blessing to many people because God was in control. Listen, this is hard to understand, but when people do wrong by us, there are good outcomes for that we just don't see. That God can be in the midst of and say, I'll take that and I'll use it. I mean, it doesn't get much worse. Like, Joseph's brothers hated him. I mean, most of us would not even be close to this kind of mistreatment, right? And God still took that and used it to bless many other people who weren't a part of that equation from the beginning. I want us to think about forgiveness this way today. Forgiveness is giving what only we can give to restore those who wronged us. Forgiveness actually takes us giving to the people who wrong us. That's what it takes. It's not just saying, okay, I don't hold it against you anymore. It's not just saying, if you pay it back, I'll forgive you. It's literally us giving what only we can give. Now, let's think about that from a different perspective. In 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9, it says this, you know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty he could make you rich. Remember that shame and honor situation earlier? So honor's up here, shame's down here. Shame and honor would continue to go this way. If you do something wrong, you continue to go down. If I do things right, I continue to go up. Instead, what Jesus did, right, he was in the place of ultimate honor, and we were in the place of ultimate shame, righteousness, unrighteousness. And instead of saying he's going to keep pushing us down, he said, I will come here so that in my poverty I can make you rich. In my righteousness, I can bring you to my righteousness. And the righteousness that we can get is only through him. It doesn't equate, like we won't become equal with Jesus, but when God looks at us, he sees the righteousness of Jesus on us because of what he paid for us. That's what forgiveness is. We give what only we can look at someone and say, we forgive you for the specific thing that they did to us. And we have to be able to give that to them to restore that relationship. Thing is, we don't want to do that. We would rather brush it off. And I feel this way too. We would rather just brush it off, say it doesn't matter anymore, go on without our lives. We just don't, whatever. Or if they pay it back, fine, then I'll do it. But that's what true forgiveness is, and that's why this is so difficult, and that's why it's so hard for us to learn and so hard for us to really, truly grasp. And thinking back to the ancient world, when they would have understood forgiveness or thought about forgiveness, they would have seen grace or forgiveness, giving someone grace, as weak. Why would you allow that person to be brought to your level? Why wouldn't you just keep pushing them down if they've wronged you? But the reality is what Jesus teaches us is that grace is never weakness. It's never weakness to offer someone forgiveness. It's not weakness to be gracious to someone else. It's actually a strength, and it's us. Again, this is the idea, right? That we would share the forgiveness that Jesus has offered to us to other people. Because what influences and guides whether or what we forgive or not is what Jesus has forgiven us. And if he was willing to give out of his richness to come to his poverty so that we could become rich, then that's what we do as well. And this is the kind of part where we can decide what we want to do. We know what we should do. We've all been in those moments. We know what we should do, just whether or not we're going to do it or not. We have to decide what that looks like. Listen, I'll say this too, that anytime that there is a spirit of forgiveness or a spirit of unforgiveness, those things are contagious. I know this, but even better, seeing this when I was a youth pastor, and I would kind of deal with kids on when they would wrong each other, someone said something they shouldn't have said, or they did something they shouldn't have done, or whatever, right? And we kind of try and navigate that with them. I could almost always see the spirit of forgiveness that was present in their home, in their lives. And if their parents were the kind of people that are no, we do forgive, it's hard, we're going to walk through it, whatever, I could see that in their kids all the time. And if their parents were no, we don't forgive, they did something wrong, I'm going to hold it against them, I could see it in their kids all the time. Your spirit of either unforgiveness or forgiveness is contagious to the people around you. And it will change what happens in the lives of people around you because of the way that you experience that and the way that you share that with other people. So here's the question that I want us to think about this week and kind of process. How can we have a more gracious presence this week? We're going to keep digging at this, and we're going to get to the point, because I think through this conversation, there's probably those of us that are we have people we need to forgive that we haven't forgiven. We've just kind of brushed them off, or they had to repay us, or they haven't repaid us yet, so we haven't forgiven them, whatever. We're going to get there. And if you need to do some work on that, do some work on that. But this week, let's think about what it would be like to be more gracious to the people around us. Someone does something wrong, are we quick to just why'd you do that? That was so awful. What was that? Or we back off for a second and kind of just give them grace? Yeah, but they need to know how wrong the thing that what they did was. Yeah, I know. But at some level, we're not the ones who bring that justice. God is, right? He's in charge of it. So how do we be more gracious to the people around us? And can we create that spirit of graciousness within ourselves and then within the people around us and really start to think about this? I hope and I pray that some of this is work that the Holy Spirit's going to do on us. I hope it's not just well, Pastor Corey talked for a little while on forgiveness, and then we kind of go. And it's not for me, it's to make sure that things are actually working in our hearts. Don't run away from that stuff. Don't just leave it behind, that's hard, I don't want to do it. Lean into that and pray about it and process it. Ask God what that looks like for you. How do you do that well? And not just blow it off and keep leaning into this idea of false forgiveness, but we truly are willing to forgive, and that we would do it in the spirit of what Jesus has forgiven us. Let's pray together.